learn differently. It's our pleasure to have Dr. Pleines with us today. So without further ado, take it away.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you. I am so excited to be here and to share a little bit about my experience and some of the current research on self-care and also on stress and some of the psychotherapy involved. So I just wanted to share a little bit about how I ended up working with so many families who have a child or teen on the autism spectrum, just to give you a sense of sort of how passionate I am about this and, just how much I care. So I sort of fell into this. Throughout my career, I had always had maybe one or two kids on my caseload with autism and always really loved working with them. Fast forward, I started my private practice and happened to get a referral for maybe an 8-year-old with autism. I had no idea how few therapists worked with this population. And so from there, I just, the referrals just started coming in. And, and I've found that even in a city with as many resources as New York, it's really an underserved population. And so I'm just really happy to be a part of this community and I'm, really involved in it and, happy to share. So I am going to get started over here. Here we go. So this is sort of my outline for how today will go. I want to give you a little bit of background. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on data, but I will give you a little bit of background on statistics, autism prevalence, and on stress. This wouldn't be a presentation in 2020 without a little bit of coverage on the pandemic and what that's been like. And then I want to explain to you why self-care is important. And being that I think many of you are parents and caregivers, I want to be realistic and talk about how we're going to get into self-care. How are we going to carve this time out? I know that your schedules are pretty intense. And there's a lot on your plates. So we're going to get into the nitty-gritty details of how we do this. And I'm going to share a little bit about what I do in my practice with the parents I work with. And then, of course, we'll save some time for questions. I've set this presentation up so that you can come back to it and use the resources later on. So there are certain slides I'm not going to, for example, I've got some videos. I'm not going to show them to you now for the, in the interest of time, but I've set this up so that you can look at it later and watch anything that's interesting to you. So you may be aware of this. Diagnosis is on the rise in the United States. I'm going to show you some statistics that are just from the last few years alone. 2012, we were looking at about 1 in 68 kids who were diagnosed with autism. Fast forward a couple of years, that number becomes 1 in 59. For contrast, we have in Shanghai, closer to 1 in 1,200, which I think is a very interesting comparison. We won't have time to get into that right now, but I think it's very interesting. Fast forward just another 2 years, this number just came out in March. Now we're looking at more like 1 in 54 kids are diagnosed with autism, which, really significant numbers. And they're, it's growing pretty quickly, from 2012 to 2016. We went from 1 in 68 to more like 1 in 54. And with those numbers rising, we've got to think about parents. I've seen, some really great services come along for, for kids on the autism spectrum. And with that, there's such a need for parents as well. Parents have a lot on their plates. Whoops, uh-oh. I'm so sorry. I lost my my slides. Here they are. Here we go. And so with some of these developments, we've got more services. So, I feel very strongly about also meeting the needs of, this growing parent population. Many of you are already very familiar with this, but I know that parents also have a lot to deal with during the whole process of diagnosis. I work with a lot of families who've either not started the process or have just come out of it and their heads are spinning. Between, lengthy wait lists, I mean, I'm based in New York City, and sometimes I still have folks, coming an hour on the subway to come see me. And this is New York. There's, it's much more difficult in more rural areas to, find services. Sometimes insurance covers things, sometimes it doesn't. So there's also this huge financial aspect. One thing that I think is kind of interesting, other countries have a hard time with this too. In the UK recently, they found that 61% of families were not super happy with the information they received when they did get the diagnosis. Additionally, there's, it's a lengthy process. From first contacting a health professional to actually having confirmation that this is what's going on. In the UK, at least, recently, it was 3.5 years. And I find that that's pretty consistent with what a lot of my families go through. Obviously that number sort of varies with the level of functioning. Sometimes the kids who fall under that more, stereotypical Asperger's umbrella, which we don't use the term Asperger's anymore, but it's, sometimes they take a lot longer to get diagnosed. I also think that it's really important that we don't forget the added stress that racism in healthcare presents for many families. I've got a handful of statistics here about this. And these numbers are from 2002 and 2007, so they're, a little bit outdated, but not much. Often children who are Black are diagnosed a 1.5 years later. They have required triple the number of visits over a length of time that's 3 times longer than that of Caucasian children. I mean, this number to me is, I mean, it's unbelievable. African American children are also in this study 2.6 times less likely to receive that autism diagnosis than Caucasian children on their first visit. And if they're not given the autism diagnosis, what they're most likely to be labeled with is actually ADHD, which says a lot about some of the perceptions of folks in healthcare. Another, along the same lines, we've also got related to cognitive impairments. So when Hispanic and Asian children present at a visit with cognitive impairments, clinicians are less likely to continue looking for other things like autism. They're more likely to just sort of be labeled with something like strictly an intellectual disability. And then, they've also, some researchers have gone back and looked at other studies to see what else is out there. In terms of some of these disparities. And often they do find that, there's a lot of evidence that this is real, which I think lines up with the experience of many of the folks I work with. I wanted to sort of pause on this slide and talk a little bit about just sort of what this looks like today. These studies are a few years old, and, given the current environment, this is something that comes up a lot in my practice, both with kids and with their parents. I have found that parents really want to find the language to talk to their kids about racism, and it's difficult. And in the current environment, it's already a very challenging time, and this is an added type of stress. Kids potentially asking questions about protests and police brutality. This is a topic that I think we could spend a whole additional webinar talking about how to talk to kids about this stuff. But I just wanted to frame it in terms of, for the purpose of this presentation, the added stress for caregivers. This is another thing, you're experiencing it yourselves and you're trying to help your children with it. So now we're moving along the process, and we move out of the diagnosis process and all that goes along with it into new stressors. One study interviewed several parents and found that even though it was a relief to know what was going on, it also, they also found that as difficult as that process was, the following years were actually more difficult because it's so hard to find services and it's so hard to put everything in place. And I'll get to that a little bit more as well. And also, just a sort of side note here, I'm framing a lot of these things as stressors, but this won't all be negative. We've got so many things we can do to combat this stress, and I will get to that very soon. So post-diagnosis, we've got services. I'm sure many of you have been on wait lists. Maybe you're still on wait lists. What does that IEP look like? Do you qualify for an IEP? Do you qualify for, here in New York, we've got OPWDD, which, pays for a lot of services if you qualify, if you can manage to get through many of the testing hoops to prove that you qualify. So you're advocating on the educational front, you're advocating on the legal front. What does childcare look like? And then, of course, parents are people too, and you're coping with what that diagnosis brings for you. Another thing that happens down the line, and this is something actually that I talk a lot with my families about, how to disclose this diagnosis to your child or teen. Understanding their diagnosis is so important because later on, some of your children will be learning to advocate for themselves as well. And another piece of this that I talk a lot about with my families is, the parents' experience. Sometimes, and you may not have fully put this into words or recognized this, or maybe it's something you think a lot about, but many folks carry this experience of internalized guilt or shame, depending on, where you are, and it could be family background or your social circle. You may experience some stigma, and some folks worry, is this something I did? Could I have prevented it? Is this in my genes? Did I pass this on? You may feel like I've failed as a parent. I should be doing more. I should be more on top of things. And this narrative becomes internalized and can manifest, as stress, as headaches, many, many different things. And it doesn't feel great. So I think, as a community, I think we do have to work a little harder to support parents on some of this stuff. So just to sort of highlight, what this can look like, I wanted to just share a brief case example. And of course, masking identifying details, to protect the identity of clients is always super important. But this is a very typical example of what this process can look like. And, there are many points of stress along the way. So one family I work with, we have an 8-year-old with 2 younger siblings. This particular child has had some services since the age of 2 or 3, has been diagnosed with some sensory stuff. So this means that this child has been receiving occupational therapy for years, and around the time that he's 7 years old, starts to exhibit some new symptoms. his tantrums become much worse. There's some aggression towards siblings. There's some change in grades at school. The behavior issues are becoming more and more difficult to contain safely. And the providers involved sort of disagree about what's going on. So we have an occupational therapist who believes that this is strictly some sensory issues that can be worked out. The pediatrician thinks maybe there's more going on, and the teachers are just fed up. So at this point, the family is referred to me. I start doing play therapy and try to sort of get a sense of what might be going on. Now, as a social worker, I can make recommendations, but typically if I believe that autism is something that might be happening, I have a neuropsychologist who I often collaborate with, who sometimes will pick things up from there while I continue providing therapy. Unfortunately, at this point, so we have, I try some play therapy, some CBT, and we're not really seeing a ton of improvement. So at this point, I recommend some more testing, and then we begin the process of trying to find a neuropsychologist who either doesn't have a long wait list and someone who can slide their fee a bit, or sliding the fee is big. So this is where we get stuck, because no other services can get put into place until we really know what's going on. And so then you begin this sort of months-long process of getting off the wait list, still having a pretty significant financial expense, and then sort of taking it from there. So, and this is obviously, watered down a little bit, but this is in a nutshell what so many families go through. And, imagine that this starts at age 2, where there's some services in place for years, and fast forward to age 8, and still this family doesn't quite have a sense of what's going on. They're, kind of beating themselves up about not, worrying that they're not taking it seriously enough, or that they should have taken it more seriously sooner, or that they missed something, or they didn't give them enough attention. And, this is, again, very, very typical. Now, here we go. So this was all difficult for parents before 2020. So now here we are. This is already a pretty difficult system to navigate. And then we throw COVID-19 into things. There is a lot on your plates. You're homeschooling, you've got, potentially other children to take care of. There's a lot going on. Now, one thing that I think is kind of cool, here we are, end of July, we're starting to see some really interesting research come out about the impact of the pandemic on people's mental health. One study, this just recently came out, was on the psychological impact of COVID-19 on folks in China. And so this study showed that a significant number of people reported experiencing at least a moderate psychological impact, with another decent chunk of people reporting at least moderate depression symptoms and anxiety symptoms. So, and this is just the early research. So I think we're going to continue to see that, this has put quite a bit of strain on people. And I don't even know that we need research to know that, right? We're all living it. Now, back to you. Parenting during this time. It's not like your kids' needs go away because the world shuts down. you're still figuring out school. You are still trying to be your child's advocate. I know a lot of the folks I work with have been trying to do occupational therapy over Zoom, sometimes physical therapy. You know, I meet with everybody over Zoom myself. Sometimes you've still got an ABA provider in the mix. You know, I know some families have maybe acupuncture or, you know, other things that they're trying to keep going. Even, you know, one of those occupational therapy methods, I don't know if anyone else uses this, some of the sound therapy, the Tomatis method, you know, you're trying to make sure your child keeps up with all of these different things. You're keeping all the balls in the air, or trying to. You know, some of your kids might have had a tough time adjusting early on. How do you explain all the uncertainty? You know, we know that for, you know, most of our kids, that routine and structure is so important. So early on, I know a lot of my families really had a hard time with this. I don't know if anyone else has had this experience, but now fast forward a couple months or a few months, I do find that a lot of my teenagers, at least, are pretty comfortable having more time at home, and, you know, which presents a new worry for parents. How am I going to get them back out into the world? You know, are we going to have, that's going to be quite an adjustment. You know, I don't know how many of you had that early pressure to have a Pinterest-worthy schedule board for your kids. You know, there's pressure everywhere. Many of you are working. You may have other children. You may also have aging parents you're taking care of. You know, there's many things that are all kind of being juggled. And this is the experience, I think, of, you know, I think universally, this is pretty across the board. So now that I've reminded you of all these stressful things, I hope you're not thinking, I better go get back to my to-do list. Oh my gosh, been reminded of all this stuff. So with all these things, why on earth would you add another thing to your list? Well, I will tell you why. So why self-care? So especially when stress is high, it is extremely important that you take a little time for yourself. You may already be familiar with some of this, but the impact of stress goes on and on and on. I could go on all day about it. Just a few ways that stress can affect your body. You know, it's linked to heart disease, high blood pressure, mental health. When stress is high, you might experience other physical symptoms like low energy, headaches, stomach problems. Stress affects your immune system. You know, stress is linked to substance misuse. Stress can even impact your skin and your hair. It impacts a lot, right? I think most of us already know that. And so finding small ways to take care of yourself will really pay off, because you're going to physically feel a little bit better. And we all know when we physically feel a little bit better, we are more able to tackle the obstacles in front of us. And we're more able to connect with the people around us. I don't know if anyone else has had, I mean, I'm sure you have had a really, really hectic day where you sort of, you know, you get a lot of things done, you sort of rush through the day, but then you pause at the end of the day and you look back and you can't, maybe don't even remember much of it because you've been so activated the whole day and just sort of in go mode, ignoring your needs. You know, it's so easy for us to do. And I mean, I'm guilty of it too sometimes. But this is why, you know, what this next half of the presentation is going to cover some really good stuff. So there's a lot of different ways you can practice self-care, and I'm going to get into each one of these, but they tend to fall into these buckets, and there's a lot of overlap. So, you know, and it's not cut and dry, but we've got physical, emotional, spiritual, mental, social self-care. And then this last bucket, which is sort of like the taking care of business bucket, which I'll get into in a second. Before we do this though, I just want to pause and emphasize something. So as much as I would love it if everybody I worked with had an hour a day to themselves, I know sometimes that just cannot happen. So I want us to begin thinking about activities that fall into different little time frames. And if you truly only have 60 seconds to yourself today, that's okay. We can work with that. These are activities, so hypothetically, if you've only got 60 seconds, we're looking at activities that can easily be planned for. It doesn't require much to pop into the bathroom and take a minute to yourself. Or it might not. I mean, that might also require planning depending on what you've got going on. You know, and so at little intervals, you know, there might be things that take 5 minutes or 10. You might even be able to look out a couple months and plan for a few hours to yourself, something you're really looking forward to, something that you don't do very often, but it will require more planning. So keep these timeframes in mind, because I want to focus also on being realistic. So this chart is actually more than just an Excel spreadsheet. So this little calendar is based on something called behavioral activation, which is a cognitive behavioral therapy strategy. And it's often actually used to help people with depression. And the idea is that you begin to create healthy habits little by little. And it's based on the premise that how we act strongly influences what we think and how we feel. So that's really the premise of cognitive behavioral therapy, that our thoughts are influenced by our actions are influenced by our feelings. It's a triangle with each piece of it impacting the other. And so this little calendar, it's not just a spreadsheet, it's an evidence-based strategy that is informed by research, specifically cognitive behavioral therapy. So what I often do with my clients is we will take a look at a little calendar. You can use one like this. You can use a planner that you already have. You might even right now, while we're talking about this stuff, you might want to grab a notebook and just kind of quickly jot down the next few days and start to make a list. But the idea is that we start small and you look ahead and you pick a couple parts of your week where you know you can focus on yourself. You know, the idea is that self-care helps you feel more like yourself. It recharges you, it refills your cup. So now, back to those buckets. So physical self-care can be pretty straightforward. Exercise, food, water, deep breathing. Even though these sound basic, they're really not. You know, how many of us, you know, unless you make a point of having a jug of water next to you all the time, how many of us are super hydrated all the time? You know, how often do we, you know, start at the beginning of the week and say, am I going to exercise at all this week? You know, some of us are in great routines with this, but for some of us, it requires a little more planning. You know, even, you know, this is one, I'm guilty of this too. Sometimes, you know, I have a day with a bunch of sessions in a row and I look at the clock and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I was supposed to get a snack in between appointments and I forgot. And then I think, oh, that's why I'm so grouchy when I wrap up. Now, this is a super, super easy exercise you can do when you only have a few seconds. So this is one you don't have to do much planning. This is a really great grounding exercise. So you can kind of position yourself comfortably in your chair, or you can, if you're standing, that's okay too. Sort of take a big breath in And then you look around. Name 5 things you can see. You know, I'm looking around, I see a candle, I see a notebook, my water glass, my phone, my AirPods. 4 things you can hear. You know, all right, let me really focus. I can hear a bird outside, the air conditioning, my voice, a neighbor in the hallway. So, and I, you know, we don't have to go through the whole thing, but this is a really nice grounding exercise. You kind of bring yourself back to your body and just kind of check in with yourself. So this is something nice and easy that hopefully is a tangible, easy tool you can leave with today. Now, deep breathing, if if there is one thing you take from today, deep breathing has huge health benefits. You know, this is just one of many studies, but this particular study, a 12-week study, found that folks who participated in a weekly, or I think daily, slow breath exercise training experienced a lot of health benefits. Decreased heart rate, decreased blood pressure, and their perceived stress was also lower. So this is just, you know, relearning how to breathe, basically. You know, and we can relate this back to my slide a couple minutes ago on stress. This is an easy way to combat some of the things that you're up against, coping with. This is a video that you can come back to if you'd like. Here's another one. I'm not going to show these. They're just for you if this is something you're interested in. Guided relaxations are another physical strategy you can use to combat stress. Now, emotional self-care. This is different for everybody. Like I said, you know, there may be overlap with other buckets. This can be, you know, therapy, journaling, creative outlets, checking in with yourself a little more often. Now, here's an example of a self-care exercise that you can actually also do with your child or with, you know, you could do it with a loved one too, you know, a partner, friend. But I wanted to give you a couple options in case you do want to do it with a child. I use this all the time in my practice. All it is, at the end of the day, the child looks back at their day and checks off which feelings they felt. Some of my kids will do this on their own. A lot of the time, kids do need more support. You know, you can make this more simple. You can make it more complicated. You know, there's a lot of room to adapt. But the idea is that a lot of folks don't realize what they feel throughout the day. We tend to kind of push through. And when you look back, you might find that, you know, you were really frustrated about something that happened. You were maybe even angry about something that happened with, you know, with a loved one. Maybe you pushed through some sadness and some stress. There's a lot going on right now. You know, so this is the kid version. Now, I love this. Now, bear with me for a second. The first time another therapist suggested to me using this with adults, I sort of was like, what? A feelings chart for adults? Are you sure? Now, check it out. So this wheel is actually really, really cool. The full range of human emotions is really big. You know, how often have you been able to pinpoint, you know, like there's some really great ones here: disillusioned, perplexed, cheeky. I got a kick out of that one. You know, but there, you know, it categorizes what we feel and it gives us a bigger range. So sometimes taking a look at this at the end of the day, and again, just checking in with yourself can keep things from building up. And I've also, you can find this, I've got the site right here. There's a lot of versions of it you can easily Google. Spiritual self-care. You know, if you're religious, it can, you know, it can be church, it can be, you know, it could be something, you know, that falls within, you know, your particular religion, but spirituality doesn't have to be religious. For some people, yoga or art might be a spiritual experience, reflecting, you know, just really kind of taking that time to connect with yourself and connect with something bigger. One book recommendation that I think could fall into this category, I've recommended this to a lot of folks. It's a pretty solid recommendation. This book is called Happier Now: How to Stop Chasing Perfection and Embrace Everyday Moments. This particular author does a very good job of giving you prompts of things to think about and things to try, while also still staying pretty realistic and reasonable. And this is just a quick blurb if you're curious about that book, a little video by the author that you can come back to. Taking care of business. This is one of my favorites because sometimes these little things are totally underrated. You know, and sometimes it's a huge privilege to have time to do some of these things. This could be something, these are practical things like organizing something that's going to make your life a lot easier, finishing a little project, stepping out to run an errand by yourself, you know, completing something that has just been taking up a lot of space in your mind. You know, I have a great example. You know, someone I worked with was trying to you know, do some of these self-care things and make a little more space for herself, and said to me that, you know, I lost my water bottle and I just kept forgetting to buy a new one. And anytime I went anywhere, I would have to buy a bottle of water. And it was just, you know, and then it would pop into my mind and I'd forget about it again until I needed a drink of water. And I finally bought a water bottle and I feel so good. You know, and we all have little things like that that just sort of, you know, you walk through the kitchen and you're like, oh shoot, I'm out of whatever. You know, or that chair's broken. I've really got to order a new chair. And so now just for yourself, can you think of one thing that you haven't had time to do? Something that, you know, wouldn't be super time intensive, just one small thing. Go ahead now and just jot it down so you can come back to it later. And, you know, yeah, just for you. And we're gonna troubleshoot a little bit with, you know, ways to carve out the time for these things. We'll get to that in a minute. So mental self-care. This, you know, encompasses some of the other, you know, again, like I said, there's some overlap, but this could be reading a book that's just for fun, crossword puzzles, learning something new, maybe starting a new hobby. You know, one that I've been, I mean, I think, you know, one thing that I sort of had fun was learning how to use, this is going to sound a little silly, but I reorganized the kitchen and learned how to use this thing that makes labels, and I learned how to make pretty labels. So it felt a little creative, it was a little bit practical, but, you know, learning to use this new machine felt a little bit of mental stimulation because I don't normally do things like that. So, you know, you can get creative with it. Just something that helps you switch gears and use your brain for something different. And then I'm going to show you a quick exercise that's definitely a mental exercise on reframing unhelpful thoughts. Now, if anyone has ever worked with a therapist before, this might be familiar to you. But this is one of the most, you know, basic cognitive techniques that we teach people. So you essentially, you try to pinpoint a thought that's unhelpful to you, something that's maybe a little bit unrealistic, a little negative, and then we work with it. So this is one I hear a lot. I'm always behind, there's never enough time, and I'm never gonna do it differently. I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna tell you the same thing next week. I never change. Now, the feeling that goes along with that, inadequate, defeated, sad, you know, the list could go on. When you feel that way, most of us, we shut down, we kind of give up, and then we continue to feel inadequate. Now, if we take that thought and we try to reframe it, it could look something like this. Sometimes I'm behind and I have a lot on my plate, but I'm working on it. A lot of people are struggling right now, and I'm really doing my best, and I have made some really positive changes, something like that. When you talk to yourself this way, you're not going to feel as defeated. You might feel less alone, a little more motivated, and the way you look at yourself is going to feel a little more positive. And when you feel that way, you're going to feel a little more capable of taking action and trying to do something a little differently. I think social self-care is incredibly important right now. I would really recommend, even if you've got a lot on your plate with caretaking, trying to find a way to do something, either if you feel safe, you may not, and that's okay, socially distanced with a friend or a loved one, talking on the phone or Zoom. I mean, many of us are kind of zoomed out, but, trying to make a point of feeling that connection with somebody that gets you, I think is very important. And a lot of folks I work with find that participating in something strictly for parents, it makes a big difference. So this could be parent groups, and I've compiled a list of agencies that are doing virtual parent programming right now, which is posted separately and also on this PowerPoint. But connecting with other parents can make a big difference. I've found that when parents get together, I run this parent share once a month, and sometimes I take a back seat because the parents in the group have recommendations for each other about even just the logistics of wrapping up screen time or earning screen time or getting their teen out for a walk. Other parents tend to get it in a way that other people might not. And one other small silver lining that I've heard from other, parents that I work with is that even though Zoom makes it, we can get kind of technologied out, all of this virtual programming sometimes opens doors to programming you would have otherwise not been able to participate in. Just because of logistics, childcare, things like that. And on that note, I was also just going to briefly mention that telehealth really does have a lot of potential. Like I mentioned earlier, research is already starting to come out, on things that have been studied since the pandemic started. And one particular study actually was on like a parent skills training. This particular study was with veterans, but this parent training was via telehealth, and it actually had tons of potential for improving mental health, improving parenting stress, and overall family functioning, which I thought was pretty cool, that all of these things can happen from home. And then, like I said, parent support groups too. And parent support groups, I think, are very open, where any groups I've run, sometimes, kids are running in the middle. And it happens and everybody gets it and it's totally okay. So, I think that's a really great option. Now, back to that spreadsheet that we looked at a minute ago. As you start to make your self-care calendar, you might need to think about things like, who's going to cover for me? If this is a household with one parent, the coverage is going to require a lot more planning. Who can you ask for help? Is it hard to ask for help? If childcare help is not an option right now because of the virus, where in your calendar can you choose one thing for yourself? Like I mentioned, deep breathing can be a great option. And I always, I try to tell all of my clients this, try to keep one promise to yourself each day, big or small, pick one thing and try to stick to that. And you will, I do think, people tend to feel pretty good when that promise to themselves is something they can follow through on. And then, when all else fails, I think it can be really helpful to focus on what is in your control today. This might be something small, might not be, but, getting creative, relying on your support system, and trying to choose, one or two things that can be beneficial to you will go a long way. And like I said, I do wish everybody I worked with had more time to themselves, but I know that's not an option. And so I want you all to sort of come away from this knowing that even in these sort of altered circumstances with, social distancing and homeschooling, potentially more in the fall, there are still things that are within your control, and there are still ways to try to manage some of this stress. And and that is about it from me. I wanted to thank you all for having me and being a part of this. And we have a few minutes for questions. Oh, and I'm so sorry, one more thing. All of my resources are here. So I've got some wonderful groups with agencies and practices that are local to me. Some videos that I've mentioned. TED Talks tend to be a great resource. If there's something you're interested in that's related to this, see if there's a TED Talk on it. These are some of the books. One I mentioned, others that are client approved, and then my references. But I also wanted to mention, if you are not local, feel free to reach out to me. I might be able to point you in the right direction. And thank you.
Thank you so much. We did get a few questions in. Feel free to send others in if you haven't done so already. We did have one request to go back to the sample self-care planning sheet that you shared. I think it was earlier in the deck.
Sure, let me go back to that.
And while Kristin is doing that, just a reminder, we are posting a recording of this talk on our website, along with the slides and a list of resources. So that should be going up in the next few days.
Yeah, and I can also put together, I can just make a spreadsheet for you all and post it. So this was the one?
Yes. Yeah. I think someone just wanted to take a look at it again. So this will be posted at sparkforautism.org. And then when you go on the website, you'll see a tab called Discover. And when you click there, you'll be able to see all of the recordings from our past webinars. And this one would be near the top since it's newer. So does anyone else have any questions? Feel free to send them in. Let's see here. Interesting. Okay, someone's asking about if you have recommendations on how to deal with jealousy of others who have children without any disabilities, like how you would manage emotions around that.
So I think, depending on the age of the child, a lot of the time jealousy comes out of some unmet need. I'm thinking even, when kids are really little and they don't want to share, it's such a normal thing to try to keep what you think you really need to try to get your needs met. And so I usually try to look at jealousy that way. What does the person think they're protecting? What do they think they're not getting? What need are they trying to get met with that behavior? All emotions are valid, everybody's feelings are real. Sometimes we can pinpoint, what need is, underlying that feeling. if that makes sense.
Okay. Someone is interested in, if you have any recommendations to find a therapist that might focus on parents who have kids with ASD.
Yeah, absolutely. So depending on where you're located, it might be, I mean, it might actually be a little bit easier now because of telehealth. It opens your options a little bit because so many providers are using, you know, Zoom, you know, or some other, you know, HIPAA compliant platform. So what you could do is probably look at, you know, you can widen your search to your whole state, because anybody that anybody that's licensed in your state can do telehealth. Obviously, that doesn't help if eventually you want to, you know, begin seeing someone in person. But for now, you can, you know, you can use Psychology Today. You can use ZocDoc, and then, you know, what I tend to do is suggest that folks schedule like a free consult or send an email to anyone that you're interested in meeting with to make sure they have the experience you're looking for. A lot of therapists will list it on their website if that's, you know, a population they specialize in. You could also try, if you're a part of any like parent groups or forums on Facebook or any other like parent listserv type of things, you could try asking around. Sometimes, you know, a therapist will sort of develop a little bit of a niche where, you know, they might see people from the same like parent organization. So that's a possibility too.
Okay. And do you have any experience with parents who are thinking about starting their own virtual parent support group, or do you have any suggestions about how someone might go about that?
Oh, that's a wonderful idea. I mean, I think if you ask around, I mean, I'm just thinking, you know, it depends on your comfort level. You know, if you're just looking for parents with similar experiences and you want to do something informal, you know, you might go through your child's school and kind of put the word out that way. Another option, again, I think, you know, community groups, if you're a part of any, could be another great place to start. I know a lot of people are parts of different like Facebook groups for parents. I've heard of people doing that where, you know, they might even, I've actually also heard of people doing a sort of like asynchronous support group over Zoom, or not Zoom, WhatsApp, which if anyone doesn't know, it's sort of like a chat app that you can just put on your phone. And so parents who are super busy might not all be free at the same time. So you know, this sort of informal group could just talk to each other over Zoom. I don't know a ton about like the logistics of, you know, an informal peer support kind of group, but I think that would probably be a good starting point.
Okay. I actually have a question. I know you didn't have time for it during this presentation, but could you sort of verbally walk through breathing exercises for people? I know you had a video in there, but kind of
Yeah.
what would you do? How do you start?
Yeah, absolutely. You basically, when I do this with folks in the office, we both kind of sit as comfortably as we can on the chairs. My chair here is not as comfortable as my chair at the office, but you just sort of relax into your seat and slowly start to just focus on your breath. And so the idea is that you inhale and then hold it and slowly exhale. Now, if you look this up, different videos and different sites will say different things about how many seconds each part of this should be. Some people call it square breathing. Some people call it 4-4-6. You know, 4 seconds in, hold it 4 seconds, 6 seconds out. But what you really have to do is find what feels right for your lungs. as long as you're doing this slowly and exhaling slowly, you'll find what's right for you. And I would definitely like watch some of these videos since they'll take you through it. But you know, when you do this slowly, what actually happens is, you know, the part, if you're in an anxious place, the part of your brain that's in control is the more primitive part of your brain, the parts of the inner parts of the brain that we share with, you know, all other animals. And so when you train yourself to breathe slowly, you actually give the more evolved parts of your brain a chance to regain control. So it's such a useful skill. You know, and again, I would see if you like some of these videos that I've posted, because they'll take you through it, and they'll do a little bit of a better job than I just did.
Thank you for that. That was helpful. So we are out of time, unfortunately, but thank you again.